Good morning and welcome back to Dr. Logic Awkwardly Does Logic in Her Kitchen. In my previous video, I intimated that we were going to start talking about a notion of logic, a notion of argumentation that doesn't have deductive validity as its gold standard definition for what counts as a good argument. Before I start motivating an alternative conception of good argument, I want to actually say a little bit about like what logic is for and the different ways in which the different kind of contexts and places that it can be useful, that it can be applied. So thinking back to our very initial discussions about logic being the study of good argumentation, argumentation comes in many different kinds, many different contexts, and many different goals. And this is something that kind of traditional study of logic tends to just either forget about or overlook or deliberately ignore. This fact that logic is actually a situated activity that has particular purposes and particular ends in mind. As a result, not it's not always going to be the case that there's one logic that fits all. It's not there are people out there who kind of argue for the one true logic and they say this is what you should always be using. But it's an interesting question to ask, like, where does that normative force come from? What is underlying that should use? Because when you think about it, the kinds of contexts in which people use argumentation and use reasoning are generally not very uniform. There's a lot of flexibility in them. And wouldn't it be more interesting rather than trying to like have a great big hammer and think everything is a nail for this hammer and say, okay, shoehorn everything into this one system? Wouldn't it be better, both more interesting and somewhat more intellectually honest, to say, okay, well, what are the contexts in which we are using these sorts of tools, and what are the best ways to represent what is going on there? And you can still have a normative aspect. You can still say, okay, and what is necessarily going on there, what should be going on there, but maybe have just a little bit more flexibility about it. In particular, I want to argue that there are sort of three main levels at which logic, argument, just a moment. Hey, sometimes the cat can't be kept out of the sink. Three levels of contexts, broadly speaking, where logic or argumentation come into play. Now, the first I call the ontic level. This is where we have facts about objects, what exists, what doesn't exist, relations that they have. So, relations between objects, but also relations between facts about these objects. Because if you think about it, that's what validity is picking out. It's picking out a relational fact between the premises and the conclusion. So this is where our gold standard definition of good argument lives. It is about facts out there in the world that exist, whether or not we are engaging with them. So an argument can be valid even if nobody ever kind of goes through the work of showing that it is valid. These relations between the premises still exist. We could have sound arguments, so valid arguments with true premises, even if we don't know that the premises are true. The argument would still be sound. So this is kind of like a very foundational level. It's about what things are out there and what are the relations between them. But in fact, most of the time, we are arguing at a slightly less rarefied level. We're arguing at levels of, we're arguing with things that we know something about, or that we believe about, or that we have evidence for, or that we have good reason to think are true, or that we have justification for. And so this is what I'm going to call the epistemic level. So this is about what we know, or what we believe, or what we have evidence or justification for. So in this case, we might not necessarily have, we might not know, we might not have access to the actual facts, but we do have access to some of the facts, and we have access to our knowledge, and we have access to, we know what counts as evidence for or against a certain truth. So we can think of this as not necessarily arguments don't necessarily give us this necessary connection of truth, but maybe if I give you a certain sort of premises, then at this more epistemic level, they can be reasons for you to be justified in thinking that the conclusion is true. So this is a weaker connection between premises and conclusion, but it's still it's a legitimate one to explore. And in fact, it's probably the one that we use most often in trying to reason through something for our own purposes, or try to argue with somebody else to persuade them to change their mind or adopt a course of action. We don't give them valid arguments where the premises necessarily lead to the conclusion. We give them premises that they know or believe in or have evidence for, and show how they provide evidence for the truth of the conclusion, even if it doesn't necessarily guarantee it. And then we have a third level, which is even weaker still. And this is what I call the dialectical level. And this is what we argue about when we are kind of arguing for the sake of argument, or perhaps that isn't quite the right way to put it. What we can say is what we adopt for the sake of argument. So you might have some premises that you don't have any justification for or any support for, but you might say, okay, well, if we adopt these for the sake of argument, what follows from that? That's the naughty cat who can't be kept from licking the kitchen sink. So this is, you might think, okay, well, why would we want to do this? Why would you just adopt something for the sake of argument? Well, philosophers do it all the time. Also, logicians do it when we are doing subproofs and we're saying, well, suppose that phi is true. Well, then I could get a contradiction. Therefore, phi must be false. But apart from kind of those flip and side remarks, there is an entire genre of logic that was developed over the course of about 200 years and was still being used for another 100 or 200 years after that. And these are something I hope to talk about in a future video, because I've done a lot of research on them myself and they are super fun. They are these medieval disputationes de obligationibus, or as they're often just called, obligaciones. So these are a type of formal argumentation. It's a two-player back and forth sort of disputation, which has a very constrained set of rules that one of the players must respond by. These rules obligate them to act in a particular way, and that's where the name comes from. But these almost always start from premises that we know are false, but then you need to try to reason in a consistent fashion so you don't end up in a contradiction. So very quickly, kind of summarizing what we have here, the Ontic level focuses on arguments where the premises are true regardless of what we know or have access to. So in the ideal world, a sound argument will be one that is valid and has true premises, regardless of whether we have access to know if the premises are true or not. The epistemic level starts from premises that are known or believed or have evidence for or are justified. And the dialectical level often starts from premises that are known to be false. So what we can see is that there's a huge range of different argumentational contexts. The fact that we have been focusing almost entirely on this one, and the fact that most logicians tend to focus entirely on this one, doesn't mean that there isn't something interesting to say about the other two. Now, I told you I would hopefully say something about this bottom level in future videos, but what I actually want to focus on for the next series or so is going to be this one. This epistemic level about how do we characterize arguments that don't necessarily guarantee the truth of the conclusion, but put us in a position where we can say, okay, I now have good evidence or a good reason or a good support or a justification for acting as if the conclusion is true. So join me next time, and I will start introducing a particular system of argumentation where this is the standard of argumentation that is trying to be captured. Something that gives us good justification for our conclusions without worrying about the gold standard, the impossible to reach, or at least very difficult to reach standard of deductive validity. So take care. Join me next time. See you then.